Maya served the same frail old woman coffee every morning for 3 months, until the Vampire King walked through the diner doors with four stone-faced bodyguards, knelt before her regular customer, and called her Your Majesty. Now Maya realizes she's been pouring coffee for the most dangerous woman in the supernatural world. The fluorescent lights above Rosie's diner buzzed their familiar tune at 5:03 a.m. as Maya Torres tied her apron strings and checked the coffee machine one final time. 8 months of opening shifts had carved this routine into her bones. Brew the first pot strong enough to wake the dead, flip the sign from closed to open, and prepare for the parade of night shift workers who stumbled in seeking caffeine salvation before heading home to beds warmed by morning sun. The register held exactly $47 in bills and change, enough to make change for the early crowd, but not enough to tempt the desperate. Maya had learned to count every penny since Danny's diagnosis turned their modest savings into medical bill payments that never seemed to end. At 23, she should have been finishing nursing school, maybe dating someone who made her laugh, planning a future that stretched beyond the next shift. Instead, she measured her days in tips collected and treatments scheduled, each dollar earned bringing her brother one step closer to remission or one step further from the experimental therapy that might save his life. The pre-dawn regulars knew her story because she had stopped trying to hide it months ago. There was no shame in working hard for family, no embarrassment in choosing love over personal ambition. Frank the trucker always left an extra 5 when his delivery routes paid well. Susan from the hospital night shift brought Danny comic books she claimed were cluttering her break room. Even old Pete, who nursed a single cup of coffee for 2 hours every morning, made sure to tip exactly 15% despite his fixed income pension. They formed an unlikely community of insomniacs and early risers, people whose lives operated outside normal hours, who understood that survival sometimes meant sacrificing sleep for wages. But none of them fascinated Maya quite like the elderly woman who appeared every morning at precisely 6:17. Her arrival timed with the kind of precision that suggested either obsessive punctuality or supernatural scheduling. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The woman always claimed booth 7, the corner table that offered clear views of both the front door and the parking lot, though she seemed more interested in the newspapers she brought than any potential threats. Her order never varied. Black coffee, no cream or sugar, wheat toast with butter on the side, though Maya noticed she rarely touched the bread. The payment ritual was equally consistent. Always exact change counted from a small leather purse that looked older than the building itself. Coins that caught the light strangely and bore markings Maya assumed were foreign currency. The $20 tip that accompanied each visit was more than Maya earned in her next 4 hours of work, a generosity that transformed what should have been a routine customer interaction into something approaching friendship. Maya had started calling her Mrs. Adelheid, after the name embossed in faded gold letters on the woman's leather purse, though the customer had never offered formal introductions or personal details beyond asking after Danny's health, with the kind of genuine concern usually reserved for family. Their relationship existed in comfortable silence, punctuated by small kindnesses. Maya automatically refilling the coffee cup before it emptied, Mrs. Adelheid leaving behind newspapers folded to crossword puzzles she had already completed. The shared understanding that some connections transcended the usual boundaries between server and customer. But Maya had begun noticing details that didn't quite fit the image of a harmless elderly woman maintaining morning routines. Mrs. Adelheid's skin was paper-thin, but completely unwrinkled, as if age had touched her lightly, rather than carved the deep lines that marked most faces after 70 years. Her fingers were ice-cold, even during the August heat wave that kept the diner's ancient air conditioning running constantly, cold enough that Maya sometimes shivered when taking payment. The woman flinched whenever morning sunlight streamed through the large windows, shifting her position to remain in shadow despite the comfortable temperature. Most puzzling were the newspapers she read with such intense concentration, publications printed in what looked like Latin or some other dead language, their headlines indecipherable but apparently fascinating enough to hold her attention for exactly 43 minutes before she gathered her belongings and disappeared until the next morning. Maya had grown to look forward to these interactions, the brief moments of connection in a job that often felt like performance art, designed to extract tips from people too tired to engage authentically. Mrs. Adelheid treated her like a person rather than a service provider, asked questions that demonstrated actual listening, remembered details about Danny's treatment schedule that Maya's own relatives sometimes forgot. The $20 tips were generous enough to matter, but not so extravagant as to feel like charity, offered with the casual manner of someone who had long ago stopped thinking about money as a finite resource. In a life measured by medical bills and shift schedules, this small daily ritual had become something Maya treasured. A pocket of calm before the morning rush transformed the diner into controlled chaos. Tuesday morning started exactly like every other weekday, Maya arriving at 5 a.m. to find the diner exactly as she had left it. Clean tables and freshly mopped floors waiting for another day of service. The coffee brewed on schedule, the register counted correctly, and the first customers arrived precisely when expected. Frank grabbed his usual large black coffee and chocolate donut, leaving a $10 bill for a $6 order before heading out to load his truck. Susan stopped by for her post-shift tea and bagel, sharing gossip about hospital politics that Maya found simultaneously boring and oddly comforting in its predictability. Even old Pete arrived on time, claiming his usual counter seat and spreading his crossword puzzle across the scratched formica surface, like a territorial claim. At 6:15, Maya began preparing for Mrs. Adelheide's arrival, starting a fresh pot of coffee and checking that booth 7 was perfectly clean, despite already knowing it was spotless. She had wiped it down twice since Susan left, a nervous habit that had developed over months of wanting everything perfect for her favorite customer. The toast was ready to drop in the toaster, the butter portioned exactly as requested, the routine so familiar she could execute it blindfolded. But when Mrs. Adelheid walked through the door at 6:17, something felt wrong immediately. The usual calm composure was missing, replaced by an alertness that reminded Maya of prey animals sensing predators nearby. The elderly woman's eyes darted toward the front windows before settling on her usual booth, and she moved with less grace than normal, as if some invisible weight was pressing down on her shoulders. She claimed booth 7 as always, but positioned herself differently, facing the door instead of the windows, her newspapers remaining folded on the table rather than spread for reading. When Maya approached with coffee and her usual cheerful greeting, Mrs. Adelheid looked up with something Maya had never seen in those ancient eyes before. Fear. Not the ordinary concern of someone worried about missing an appointment or forgetting an important task, but the deep, bone-level terror of someone who knew that danger was approaching and could do nothing to prevent it. The coffee cup rattled slightly against the saucer when Maya set it down, her own hands suddenly unsteady in response to this change in their established dynamic. Mrs. Adelheid accepted the coffee with a grateful nod, but immediately pushed it aside untouched, her attention fixed entirely on the front door and parking lot beyond. Maya wanted to ask if everything was all right, wanted to offer help or comfort, but something in the woman's posture warned against normal conversation. Instead, she retreated behind the counter and watched booth 7 with growing concern, sensing that their quiet morning routine was about to be shattered by whatever Mrs. Adelheid was waiting for with such obvious dread. At exactly 6:45, the diner's front door chimes announced new arrivals, but instead of the usual construction workers seeking breakfast before their shifts, 4 men in expensive black suits entered with movements so synchronized they might have been choreographed. Maya's regular customers fell silent immediately, conversations dying mid-sentence as some primal instinct recognized predators in their territory. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees, though the morning heat outside hadn't changed and the air conditioning maintained its usual struggle against the August humidity. These weren't normal customers seeking coffee and conversation, Maya realized with growing alarm. They moved like soldiers or bodyguards, their eyes constantly scanning the room for threats while maintaining formation around the doorway. Their suits were perfectly tailored, but somehow failed to disguise the impression of barely contained violence, as if civilization was a costume they wore rather than a natural state. Old Pete folded his crossword puzzle with hands that trembled slightly, while Frank abandoned his second cup of coffee and headed for the door with the casual haste of someone who recognized trouble and wanted no part of it. Even Susan, who dealt with hospital emergencies professionally, gathered her belongings with obvious nervousness and left exact change on the counter before hurrying outside. Within moments, the diner was nearly empty, except for Maya behind the register and Mrs. Adelheid in booth 7, the elderly woman sitting perfectly still as if hoping to avoid notice through absolute immobility. Then he walked in, and Maya understood immediately why everyone else had fled. Tall enough that he had to duck slightly under the doorframe, pale skin that seemed to reject the fluorescent lighting rather than absorb it, dark hair styled with the kind of perfection that suggested professional maintenance rather than casual grooming. His eyes caught the light like mirrors or polished stone, reflecting rather than revealing, and when he moved, it was with a grace that defied normal human limitations. The expensive coat he wore despite the August heat outside suggested wealth beyond Maya's comprehension, fabric that looked like it had been tailored by craftsmen who charged more for alterations than she earned in a month. But it was the way he commanded space that truly unsettled her, the sense that his presence changed the fundamental nature of the room simply by existing within it. Everyone in the diner stopped breathing, Maya realized, including herself, as if some unconscious recognition warned that making noise might draw unwanted attention from this newcomer. He surveyed the nearly empty restaurant with casual authority, his gaze passing over Maya as if she were furniture rather than a person, dismissing her as irrelevant to whatever purpose had brought him here. His attention focused entirely on booth 7, where Mrs. Adelheid sat with the rigid posture of someone facing execution with dignity intact. Maya watched in complete shock as this imposing stranger approached the booth, his expensive shoes silent against the diner's worn linoleum floor, and dropped to one knee beside Mrs. Adelheid's table with the fluid motion of someone accustomed to formal gestures. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried an accent Maya couldn't identify, but which seemed to add weight to every syllable, transforming a single word into something that felt like both greeting and plea. "Mother," he said, and Maya felt her understanding of the world shift fundamentally as she realized that her quiet morning regular, the kind elderly woman who tipped generously and asked about Danny's health, was somehow connected to this creature who radiated power and danger like heat from a forge. Mrs. Adelheid showed no surprise at the stranger's arrival or his intimate address, her composure remaining intact as she lifted the coffee cup to her lips, with hands that betrayed no tremor, despite the obvious tension filling the diner like smoke from an unseen fire. She sipped the black coffee with the same measured pace Maya had observed every morning for 3 months, as if supernatural visitors kneeling beside her booth were as routine as sunrise or the morning paper delivery. The transformation in her bearing was subtle but unmistakable. Where moments before she had radiated elderly frailty and nervous energy, now she sat with the upright posture of someone accustomed to command, her faded European accent sharpening into crisp, authoritative English that carried centuries of practice in making difficult decisions. Victor, the imposing figure who had introduced himself as her son, remained kneeling despite the obvious discomfort. Such a position must cause someone of his evident status and physical presence. His plea carried the desperate undertone of a ruler struggling to maintain authority without the legitimacy only she could provide, his voice dropping to urgent whispers that Maya could barely hear from her position behind the counter. "The council grows restless," he said, his accent transforming ordinary words into something that sounded like formal court language, each syllable weighted with political implications Maya couldn't fully grasp. "They question your absence," he continued, and Maya caught fragments of a conversation that revealed layers of meaning she was only beginning to understand. "Let them question," Valentina replied, her English suddenly crisp and commanding in a way that made Maya realize how carefully the elderly woman had been disguising her true nature during their months of morning interactions. "I abdicated," she continued with the finality of someone who had made peace with irrevocable choices. "I chose exile." Maya remained frozen behind the counter, her hands still gripping the coffee pot she had been refilling when this impossible scene began, her mind struggling to process information that challenged everything she thought she knew about reality itself. The fragments of conversation she overheard painted a picture of political intrigue that stretched far beyond anything she had imagined possible in her quiet morning routine. Victor ruled in his mother's place, but vampire law apparently required the previous monarch's blessing for complete legitimacy, a legal technicality that left him vulnerable to challenges from enemies who grew bolder with each day of Valentina's continued absence. "There have been assassination attempts," Victor said with the weary tone of someone reporting routine workplace hazards rather than mortal threats, his confession revealing that the supernatural world operated according to rules as brutal as any human political system. "Territories are being challenged," he added, and Maya began to understand that her quiet customer's morning coffee ritual was actually the center of a power struggle that could affect countless lives she would never meet. The elderly woman she had served with such careful attention was not just connected to this strange world of supernatural politics, but was apparently central to its stability, her voluntary exile creating a power vacuum that threatened to destroy whatever fragile peace existed between competing factions. Maya's hands trembled as the full implications of this revelation settled into her consciousness, the coffee pot slipping from her nerveless fingers to crash against the floor in an explosion of ceramic shards and dark liquid that spread across the worn linoleum like blood from a fresh wound. The sound echoed through the nearly empty diner with startling loudness, drawing every supernatural eye in the room toward her position behind the counter, where she stood surrounded by the debris of her normal life. Victor's gaze locked onto hers with the intensity of a predator evaluating potential threats, and in his mirror-bright eyes, Maya saw recognition that had nothing to do with her face or identity, but everything to do with what she represented in this moment, a witness to conversations that should have remained secret, a complication in carefully laid plans, a loose thread that could unravel whatever delicate balance they were trying to maintain. The four bodyguards moved with synchronized precision toward her position, their expensive suits doing nothing to disguise the lethal purpose in their movements, while Maya stood paralyzed by the realization that her life had just changed irrevocably, simply because she had been in the wrong place at the wrong time with functioning ears and a working brain. Victor's bodyguards advanced with the fluid coordination of a military unit, their movements suggesting violence held in check by discipline rather than reluctance, while Maya backed against the coffee machine with nowhere to retreat, and no understanding of what offense she might have committed simply by overhearing family conversations. But Valentina raised one elegant hand in a gesture that carried absolute authority, stopping the approaching men as effectively as if she had erected an invisible wall between them and their target. "She knows nothing that matters, my son," Valentina said, with the calm assurance of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions based on incomplete information and personal judgment rather than established protocols. Victor's response carried the gentle but implacable tone of someone who had learned to balance affection with necessary brutality in the pursuit of political survival. "She knows enough," he replied, his voice soft but final, in a way that made Maya's blood turn to ice water in her veins. She has seen too much, he added, and Maya understood with crystalline clarity that her 3 months of friendly morning interactions had just transformed her from harmless service worker into security threat requiring permanent resolution. Maya's mind raced through every detail she had noticed and dismissed over the past 12 weeks, small observations that suddenly cohered into a terrifying pattern of supernatural truth. Mrs. Adelheide's skin that felt cold even during summer heat waves, her consistent aversion to direct sunlight despite claiming to enjoy morning walks, the way she never actually consumed the wheat toast she ordered religiously, the ancient coins that looked older than any currency Maya had ever encountered, the newspapers printed in dead languages that somehow held her attention for precisely timed intervals. The kindly old woman she had been serving with such careful attention was vampire royalty, and Maya's position as witness to this family reunion had just elevated her from anonymous waitress to security risk requiring immediate and permanent resolution. But Valentina surprised everyone in the room, including her son and his obviously lethal entourage, by making a declaration that transformed the entire dynamic of the confrontation with a few carefully chosen words. "This girl has shown me more kindness in 3 months than I received in 3 centuries of rule," she said with quiet conviction that carried the weight of absolute truth. "She will not be harmed," Valentina continued, her voice rising to the commanding tone Maya imagined she had once used to settle disputes between supernatural factions with conflicting interests and violent tendencies. "Mother," Victor began, his protest carrying the frustrated affection of someone who had clearly had this argument before in different contexts and circumstances. "It is decided," Valentina interrupted with the finality of someone who had once ruled by divine right and retained the psychological authority to make declarations that others accepted without further discussion. "But the girl must understand the consequences of her knowledge," she added, acknowledging that Maya's accidental education in supernatural politics came with obligations and dangers that would fundamentally alter her life, regardless of anyone's protective intentions. Victor stepped closer to Maya's position behind the counter, his movement fluid and unthreatening despite the obvious power he represented, and began explaining the supernatural world's fundamental rules in the patient tone of someone conducting a briefing for new personnel. "Humans who learn of vampire existence have exactly 3 options available to them," he said, with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone reciting established policy rather than making threats. "They can join supernatural service willingly, accepting the protection and obligations such employment entails. They can die to prevent the spread of dangerous knowledge to unauthorized individuals. Or they can forget through magical intervention that removes specific memories while leaving the rest of their lives intact. Since Valentina has claimed you under her protection," he continued, "the first option is the only one available," his words transforming what might have been a choice into an inevitable conclusion based on circumstances beyond Maya's control. Maya thought of Danny lying in his hospital bed, his 8-year-old face made gaunt by months of chemotherapy treatments that drained their savings while offering no guarantee of success, his absolute trust that his big sister would find a way to pay for whatever experimental therapies might save his life when conventional medicine reached its limitations. She thought of the nursing school acceptance letter still pinned to her refrigerator, the dream deferred but not abandoned despite the financial impossibility of pursuing education while working enough hours to cover medical bills and basic living expenses. She looked at the $20 bill Valentina had left on the table according to their established routine, understanding for the first time that the generous tips had never been about rewarding good service or supporting a struggling family, but about purchasing something far more valuable than coffee and toast. The experience of being treated as simply human rather than supernatural royalty, surrounded by subjects who could never forget her true nature and the power she represented. Maya realized that her morning regular had been buying 3 months of normal human interaction. Brief moments of connection with someone who asked about her family and remembered her concerns without calculating political advantages or measuring responses for signs of deception or rebellion. The money had been incidental to the transaction. What Valentina had truly been purchasing was the rare luxury of being seen as an individual rather than an institution, treated with genuine kindness rather than calculated respect, offered the simple dignity of human friendship without the complex obligations that accompanied every other relationship in her supernatural existence. Victor produced a formal contract from inside his expensive coat, parchment that seemed to generate its own faint luminescence under the diner's harsh fluorescent lighting, the document itself suggesting supernatural origins that went far beyond normal legal paperwork. The terms were outlined in precise language that left no room for misinterpretation or future negotiation. Maya would serve as Valentina's companion and protector during her continued exile from supernatural society, a position that would require her complete loyalty, but offer compensation that would solve every financial problem she had ever faced. The monthly stipend would cover Danny's medical treatments for life, including access to supernatural healing methods that went far beyond what human medicine could provide, potentially curing conditions that conventional doctors considered terminal. But the price of this supernatural employment was equally specific and non-negotiable. She could never return to her old life, or maintain contact with anyone from her previous existence. Her death would be faked to prevent awkward questions about her disappearance. Her identity would be carefully erased from official records, and she would exist permanently in the shadow world between human and supernatural societies, belonging fully to neither, but serving as a bridge between two incompatible realities. Maya asked for time to consider the offer, her voice barely audible as she contemplated a decision that would affect not only her own future, but Danny's chances of survival and recovery. Victor shook his head with genuine regret, his expression suggesting personal sympathy for her impossible position while maintaining the inflexible requirements of supernatural security protocols. "The offer expires when we leave this building," he said with the patient finality of someone who had delivered similar ultimatums before and understood their emotional impact on unprepared recipients. "Choose now," he added, and Maya realized that her morning routine of serving coffee and collecting tips had just culminated in the most important decision of her life, one that would determine not only her own fate, but the trajectory of a supernatural power struggle she was only beginning to understand. As Maya weighed her impossible options, she found herself studying Valentina's ancient eyes for some sign of manipulation or coercion, searching for evidence that this entire scenario had been orchestrated to trap her in supernatural service through manufactured desperation and carefully applied pressure. Instead, she saw something unexpected and infinitely more complex. Hope that had nothing to do with political necessity or strategic advantage, but everything to do with the fundamental human need for genuine connection and understanding. The former empress who had abdicated her throne to live quietly among humans didn't want to return to the isolation of absolute power, didn't want to resume the burden of making decisions that affected thousands of lives while surrounded by subjects who could never treat her as anything other than their supreme ruler. She wanted Maya to choose freely, not from desperation or fear, but from the kind of mutual respect and affection that had developed between them over 3 months of morning conversations and shared concern for a sick little boy who would never know how his medical bills had been paid. Maya signed the contract with hands that trembled only slightly, her signature flowing across the ancient parchment in ink that seemed to absorb into the fibers rather than resting on the surface like normal writing. The document grew warm under her fingers as she completed the binding agreement, and she felt something shift deep in her chest. Not magic exactly, but the psychological weight of crossing a threshold she could never uncross, of accepting responsibilities she didn't fully understand in exchange for the chance to save her brother's life, and perhaps find purpose in a world larger and more dangerous than anything she had previously imagined possible. As Victor gathered the signed contract and prepared to issue instructions for Maya's relocation to a secure location where she could begin her new life in supernatural service, Valentina's voice cut through the diner's tense atmosphere with the sharp authority of someone who had spent centuries making decisions that others found too difficult to contemplate. "Wait," she commanded, her tone carrying enough weight to freeze Victor's movements and cause his bodyguards to shift their attention back to the booth, where their former empress sat with the rigid posture of someone preparing to reveal information that would change everything about their current situation. Victor turned toward his mother with the patient expression of someone accustomed to last-minute complications in carefully orchestrated plans. But the look in Valentina's ancient eyes suggested that whatever she was about to reveal would be far more significant than minor adjustments to security protocols or travel arrangements. "My son," she began with the formal cadence of someone addressing a sovereign rather than family member, "there are things you must know before you return to court. Things that will determine whether you survive the next month or join your father in whatever realm awaits dead kings who trusted the wrong advisors." Victor's expression shifted from mild annoyance to sharp attention as he recognized the gravity in his mother's voice. The same tone she had once used to deliver news of wars beginning or ending, of alliances forged or betrayed, of decisions that would reshape the supernatural world according to her will and wisdom. "I did not choose exile from weariness with power or desire for human simplicity," Valentina continued, her confession demolishing the assumptions that had shaped Victor's understanding of her voluntary abdication and 3-month absence from the vampire courts. "I discovered that your closest advisor, Lord Cassius Dracul, has been systematically poisoning you with a rare toxin that mimics the effects of political stress while slowly driving you toward madness or death." Victor's face went deadly pale, his supernatural composure cracking as he processed the implications of his mother's revelation, while his bodyguards exchanged glances that suggested this information was as shocking to them as it was to their employer. Maya watched from behind the counter as the family drama unfolding in Booth 7 revealed layers of political intrigue that made her previous concerns about paying rent and medical bills seem almost quaint in comparison. Though she was beginning to understand that her new position in Valentina's service would require her to navigate these treacherous waters alongside people whose mistakes could result in consequences far beyond personal financial ruin. "The plan is elaborate and patient," Valentina explained, with the clinical detachment of someone who had spent months analyzing enemy strategy, designed to appear like natural political breakdown rather than deliberate assassination, so that Cassius can claim the throne as rightful heir, without arousing suspicion among the vampire lords who might question sudden succession under mysterious circumstances. "Your uncle was passed over when your father chose you as successor 20 years ago," she continued, her voice carrying the weight of old family grievances that had festered into homicidal ambition. "And he has never forgiven either of us for what he considers a betrayal of traditional inheritance laws that should have favored the older brother over the chosen son. Cassius believes that my policies toward humans have weakened vampire society by encouraging cooperation rather than domination," Valentina added, revealing ideological differences that went far beyond personal ambition to encompass fundamental disagreements about the future relationship between supernatural and human civilizations. "He intends to rule with the absolute cruelty that I spent centuries trying to temper, returning to the old ways of vampire supremacy enforced through terror and violence, rather than the careful balance I worked to establish between our peoples." Maya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the diner's air conditioning as she realized that the elderly woman she had been serving coffee was not just supernatural royalty, but someone whose political legacy might determine whether humans continued to coexist peacefully with creatures who possessed the power to treat them as prey rather than neighbors. Victor staggered slightly as the full implications of his mother's revelation settled into his consciousness. his hand reaching for the nearest chair, as if he needed physical support to process the idea that someone he had trusted with his life and kingdom had been slowly murdering him through carefully administered doses of supernatural poison designed to destroy his mind before claiming his throne. "How long?" he asked, with the hollow voice of someone discovering that their entire reality had been built on lies and manipulation, his question encompassing not just the duration of the poisoning, but the extent of his uncle's betrayal and the degree to which his recent political difficulties might have been orchestrated rather than natural consequences of inexperienced leadership. 3 months, Valentina replied, her answer explaining why she had chosen that precise moment to disappear from court and begin her careful investigation into the conspiracy that threatened both her son's life and the stability of the supernatural world they had worked together to govern. "I have been gathering evidence during my exile," she continued, "but I needed to be certain that you were not complicit in some scheme I had failed to understand, that your apparent cooperation with Cassius was not part of a larger plan to consolidate power by eliminating the previous generation of vampire leadership. Seeing you kneel in a human diner, showing genuine concern for my safety, rather than demanding my return for political necessity, has convinced me that you are innocent of any conspiracy against your own interests," she added, her voice softening with maternal relief, even as her words revealed the terrible danger that surrounded them. Victor sat heavily in the booth across from his mother, his supernatural grace abandoned in favor of the slumped posture of someone whose world had just been turned upside down by revelations that transformed trusted advisors into mortal enemies and political challenges into assassination attempts. Maya realized that the power dynamic she had been observing had flipped completely from her initial assumptions. Victor was not here to drag his reluctant mother back to royal duty or force her to resume responsibilities she had voluntarily abandoned, but was instead walking unknowingly into a trap that had been months in the making, orchestrated by someone who had been planning his destruction while pretending to offer loyal counsel and support. The Vampire King, who had seemed so formidable when he entered the diner with his entourage of bodyguards, was actually the intended victim of a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of supernatural government, his apparent strength and authority nothing more than elaborate camouflage for his vulnerable position as someone being slowly murdered by the person he trusted most. Maya, the human waitress with no supernatural abilities or political connections, suddenly found herself positioned as perhaps the only person who might be able to help save the Vampire King from an uncle whose patience and cunning had finally reached the moment of execution after years of careful preparation and strategic positioning. The realization that she had somehow become central to preventing a supernatural coup that could reshape the relationship between human and vampire civilizations was almost too large for her mind to process, but the weight of the signed contract in Victor's hands reminded her that she was no longer just an observer of these events, but an active participant whose choices would help determine their outcome. "Cassius will expect you to return to court with news of my continued intransigence," Valentina said, her tactical mind already working through the implications of this new information and the limited options available to them. "But now that you know the truth about his intentions, your behavior will inevitably change in ways that alert him to the fact that his deception has been discovered. He will accelerate his timeline," she continued with the grim certainty of someone who had spent centuries studying political assassination and understood the psychology of conspirators who found their carefully laid plans threatened by unexpected developments. "You may not survive the week if you return to him without a strategy for protecting yourself from further poisoning while gathering enough evidence to expose his treachery to the vampire lords who must approve any change in succession." Victor looked up at his mother with eyes that reflected not just fear for his own life, but the terrible weight of responsibility for all the people whose lives would be affected by Cassius's rise to power, the humans who would suffer under his brutal policies, and the vampires who would be forced to choose between supporting a usurper or facing execution for disloyalty to the new regime. Maya understood that she was witnessing the moment when a family argument about political duty transformed into a desperate struggle for survival that would determine the future of both human and supernatural civilizations. And her signature on that ancient contract meant that she was now committed to helping people she barely understood fight an enemy whose power and ruthlessness exceeded anything she had ever imagined possible. The diner that had been her safe haven of predictable routines and familiar customers had become the center of a conspiracy that reached across continents and species, and the elderly woman she had served with such simple kindness was about to ask her to help save the world from forces that most humans never knew existed and would never understand, even if they learned the truth about the supernatural politics that shaped their daily lives in ways both subtle and profound. The transformation began within 3 hours of Victor's departure from Rosie's diner, invisible threads of consequence pulling tight around Maya's ordinary life, with the methodical precision of a spider wrapping prey in silk that would eventually become a cocoon or a shroud, depending on how skillfully she learned to navigate the web she had unknowingly entered. Maya returned to her studio apartment after her shift ended to find subtle signs that someone had conducted a professional search of her belongings. Books returned to shelves in slightly different positions, clothes folded with military precision that didn't match her hurried morning routine. Even the dust on her windowsill disturbed in patterns that suggested careful examination of potential hiding places. Nothing was missing, but everything felt contaminated by the knowledge that strangers had touched her personal possessions while searching for evidence of connections or loyalties that could be exploited in whatever game Cassius was playing with her life as one of the pieces. The hospital called 20 minutes later with news that Danny's room had been visited by men claiming to be from a new insurance company, their credentials apparently convincing enough to gain access to his medical records and current treatment schedule. Though the nurse who spoke with Maya sounded puzzled by their interest in a pediatric leukemia patient whose family had no apparent wealth or influence worth investigating. By evening, Maya received notification from Rosie's diner management that the restaurant had been sold to a development company that planned extensive renovations. All employees would be terminated immediately with 2 weeks severance pay, and the building would be closed indefinitely while architects determined whether the structure was worth preserving or should be demolished to make room for something more profitable. The speed and coordination of these developments convinced Maya that Cassius possessed resources and influence that reached far beyond supernatural politics into the mundane world of human bureaucracy and commerce. His agents capable of manipulating legal and financial systems with the same efficiency they probably applied to more traditional forms of intimidation and violence. Valentina appeared at Maya's apartment door just after midnight, no longer the frail elderly woman who had sat in booth 7 every morning, but revealed now as someone whose centuries of experience in survival and strategy made her a formidable ally, despite her deliberately cultivated appearance of harmless old age. "We must leave immediately," she said with quiet urgency that brooked no argument or delay. Her transformation from customer to protector complete as she guided Maya through the process of abandoning everything familiar in exchange for safety that came with its own catalog of dangers and obligations. The safe house proved to be a narrow brownstone in the oldest part of the city, its Victorian architecture preserved with meticulous care that suggested both significant financial resources and genuine respect for historical authenticity, though Maya quickly learned that the building's most important features were invisible to ordinary human perception. Supernatural wards protected every entrance and window, ancient symbols carved into stone foundations that most people would dismiss as decorative elements, but which served as barriers against hostile magic and unauthorized supernatural intrusion, while the interior spaces had been modified to accommodate the specific needs of creatures whose biology and psychology differed significantly from baseline human norms. Here, Maya received her first comprehensive education in the shadow world that existed parallel to human civilization, a complex ecosystem of supernatural factions that maintained careful balance through treaties and traditions dating back millennia. Their interactions governed by laws that most humans would consider mythology, but which determined life and death for millions of beings whose existence depended on remaining hidden from mainstream awareness. Vampires formed the most politically sophisticated faction, their hierarchical courts managing territories and resources with the efficiency of multinational corporations, combined with the ruthless pragmatism of organized crime families. While werewolves operated according to pack structures that emphasized loyalty and territory, but remained flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances and opportunities. The Fae maintained their own mysterious agenda through bargains and debts that spanned generations, their magic operating according to rules that even other supernatural beings found difficult to understand or predict, while human magic users served as bridges between worlds, their mortality balanced by abilities that allowed them to interact safely with creatures who might view ordinary humans as food or entertainment rather than equals deserving respect and protection. Maya discovered that her binding to Valentina had changed her in ways both subtle and profound, alterations to her fundamental nature that were invisible to casual observation, but which marked her as something other than fully human to those with supernatural perception and understanding. She could sense supernatural presences now, a low-level awareness that manifested as temperature changes or shifts in air pressure that warned her when vampires, werewolves, or other creatures were nearby, even when they attempted to conceal their true nature through magic or simple misdirection. Basic glamours that would fool ordinary humans appeared to her as translucent overlays that distorted rather than completely disguised the supernatural beings who employed them, while her blood now carried traces of Valentina's protection that made her valuable to the former Empress's allies and correspondingly dangerous to her enemies, who might view Maya as either asset to be captured or threat to be eliminated. Victor's condition deteriorated with alarming speed as the poison in his system reached critical concentrations, his public appearances becoming increasingly erratic as memory lapses and violent mood swings undermined his ability to maintain the composed authority that vampire leadership required. Council meetings devolved into shouting matches when Victor forgot the names of lords he had known for decades, while his periods of uncontrollable bloodlust created security incidents that Cassius was quick to interpret as evidence of mental instability that made the young king unfit to rule a civilization that depended on careful restraint and political sophistication to maintain peaceful coexistence with human society. Maya watched these developments through Elena's network of informants and allies, learning that the supernatural community had grown around Valentina during her exile like a constellation of individuals whose loyalty to the former empress provided them with protection and purpose in a world where neutrality was often impossible, and choosing the wrong side could result in consequences that lasted for centuries. Marcus proved to be a werewolf whose 24-hour bookstore served as neutral ground for information exchange between factions that might otherwise view each other as competitors or enemies, his extensive collection of rare texts and current periodicals providing cover for conversations that shaped supernatural politics across multiple territories and jurisdictions. His cooperation came with the understanding that vampire leadership changes would not affect werewolf territories or the careful treaties that allowed his pack to operate their businesses and maintain their families without interference from vampire authorities, who might view lycanthrope prosperity as a challenge to established hierarchies of power and influence. Dr. Sarah Chen operated a medical practice that treated supernatural injuries with the same professional discretion she applied to human patients, her knowledge of vampire physiology and werewolf metabolism making her invaluable to creatures whose medical needs could not be addressed through conventional healthcare systems, without raising questions that would expose the hidden world to unwanted scrutiny and potential persecution. Her assistance required protection for her family from supernatural clients who did not appreciate her policy of maintaining strict confidentiality about their medical histories and personal vulnerabilities, protection that could only be guaranteed by someone with Valentina's political connections and Elena's operational capabilities. Elena herself represented the most complex alliance in Maya's expanding education and supernatural politics. A centuries-old vampire whose service as Valentina's spy master had earned her both intimate knowledge of court secrets and a comprehensive list of enemies who would be delighted to settle old scores if they ever found her isolated from the protection that association with the former empress provided. Her motivations for wanting Cassius destroyed went beyond political loyalty to encompass personal grievances involving betrayals during the last succession crisis, when she had trusted information to people who had used it to eliminate rivals rather than strengthen the stability that Valentina's reign had represented. Maya realized that she was no longer simply caught in supernatural politics, but had become an active player in a game where her decisions would affect the lives and safety of people she was learning to care about. Her bond with Valentina providing her with access to information and resources that came with corresponding responsibilities and dangers that grew more serious with each passing day. When Cassius's agents kidnapped Danny from the hospital, Maya understood with crystalline clarity that her brother had become leverage in a struggle where the stakes included not just Victor's life and Valentina's legacy, but the future relationship between supernatural and human civilizations. The kidnapping representing an escalation that transformed family protection into a test of her ability to function as the kind of operative that survival in this world required. The rescue mission that followed forced Maya's first real test as someone whose humanity was being deliberately shaped into something more dangerous and capable. Elena's training in surveillance and infiltration, combining with her enhanced supernatural awareness, to track Danny to a warehouse complex where Cassius was holding him as bait, designed to draw Valentina into a confrontation that would eliminate the former empress, while providing justification for whatever final moves the usurper planned to make against Victor's remaining support among the vampire lords. Maya's approach to the warehouse revealed her growth from frightened waitress to someone capable of violence when the people she loved were threatened, but also the psychological cost of transformation that required her to cross lines she had never imagined approaching in her previous life of shift work and medical bill management. The vampire agent she killed during the rescue attempt died with her silver blade between his ribs, the act necessary to protect Danny's life, but traumatic in ways that marked another boundary crossed in her journey from human to something else entirely, something that could function in a world where moral choices often came down to deciding which lives were worth saving and which deaths were acceptable prices for the safety of people who mattered more than abstract principles or comfortable illusions about the nature of justice and mercy. Danny's rescue was successful, but his exposure to supernatural truth meant that he could never return to the normal childhood Maya had been fighting to preserve through her work at the diner. His safety now depended on integration into the hidden world where 8-year-old boys learned to recognize vampires by scent and werewolves by the way they moved. Where bedtime stories included warnings about fey bargains and lessons in identifying the kinds of magic that could be trusted versus the kinds that would corrupt anyone foolish enough to accept their seductive promises. Victor's complete breakdown during a public council meeting provided Cassius with the opportunity he had been engineering through months of careful poisoning, the young king's attack on several vampire lords, creating a spectacle that Cassius immediately used to call for an emergency succession vote based on claims that mental instability made Victor unfit to rule a civilization that required steady leadership and careful judgment to maintain the delicate balance between supernatural factions and human society. Maya watched these developments unfold with the growing understanding that saving Victor was no longer simply about helping Valentina reclaim her son, but about preventing Cassius from seizing power that he would use to reshape supernatural civilization, according to principles that could trigger wars between factions and potentially expose the hidden world to human authorities, whose response would likely involve military action and systematic persecution that could destroy centuries of careful coexistence. The waitress who had signed a contract simply to pay for her brother's medical treatments now found herself holding responsibility for the fate of two worlds. her choices and actions determining whether the supernatural community continued to exist in careful balance with human society or descended into the kind of open conflict that would force ordinary people to choose between ignorance and terror, between the comfortable lies that let them sleep peacefully and the dangerous truths that would transform every shadow into a potential threat and every stranger into someone whose true nature might be fundamentally incompatible with human survival and prosperity. Dr. Chen worked through 3 sleepless nights in her makeshift laboratory, converting the basement of Marcus's bookstore into a medical research facility that combined cutting-edge human biochemistry with centuries of accumulated knowledge about vampire physiology and the exotic toxins that could affect creatures whose biology operated according to rules that conventional medicine barely understood. The antidote she developed represented a breakthrough in supernatural medicine, but its effectiveness depended entirely on having an active sample of the specific poison that was slowly destroying Victor's mind and body, the molecular structure of Cassius's weapon requiring precise analysis before a perfect counteragent could be synthesized and administered. Maya volunteered for the infiltration mission with the grim understanding that stealing the poison sample would require her to penetrate Cassius's stronghold, a fortress-like compound in the industrial district where the usurper had been consolidating his power while waiting for Victor's final collapse to provide him with the political justification he needed to claim the throne through emergency succession protocols. Elena spent 2 days training Maya in advanced infiltration techniques that went far beyond the basic combat skills she had been learning, teaching her to move through shadows like a predator rather than prey, to recognize and exploit the blind spots that even supernatural senses possessed, and to think like someone whose survival depended on outwitting enemies, who possessed advantages in strength, speed, and experience that could only be overcome through superior strategy and absolute commitment to completing the mission regardless of personal cost. The compound itself revealed the full scope of Cassius's ambitions when Maya finally gained access through a combination of careful timing, stolen security codes, and the kind of luck that Elena had taught her to manufacture through meticulous preparation and patience. Hidden meeting rooms contained maps and documents that outlined plans extending far beyond vampire politics to encompass a coordinated campaign designed to unite extremist factions across all supernatural communities in a war against human governments. Cassius's vision of the future involving the complete abandonment of centuries-old policies that prioritized coexistence in favor of open domination, backed by supernatural abilities that humans had no effective means of countering. Werewolf separatists who rejected pack integration with human society, Fey nobles who viewed mortal civilization as an amusing distraction that had outlived its entertainment value, and rogue magic users who believed their abilities entitled them to rule over ordinary humans formed the core of an alliance that Cassius was building through promises of territory, resources, and the freedom to exercise their supernatural nature without the restraints that Valentina's policies had imposed. Maya photographed documents and recorded conversations that revealed the true extent of the conspiracy. Evidence that would expose not just Cassius's treachery against Victor, but his plans to reshape the relationship between supernatural and human civilizations in ways that would inevitably lead to open warfare and the kind of mass casualties that both sides had spent centuries learning to avoid through careful diplomacy and mutual recognition of shared interests in maintaining stability. The poison sample itself was stored in a vault that required Maya to combine every skill Elena had taught her with abilities she was still discovering. As her bond with Valentina continued to change her in ways both subtle and profound, her enhanced supernatural awareness, allowing her to navigate security systems designed to detect and neutralize threats from creatures whose capabilities far exceeded normal human limitations. She successfully obtained the vial of toxin that Dr. Chen needed, but her escape route was compromised by timing that suggested either exceptional bad luck or deliberate manipulation by someone who had been tracking her movements from the moment she entered the compound. Cassius himself waited in the corridor that should have been her path to freedom. his presence there too convenient to be coincidental, and too well prepared to be the result of random patrol schedules or security protocols. Maya realized with growing horror that he had known about her infiltration attempt from the beginning, had allowed her to penetrate his stronghold and gather intelligence that he wanted her to possess. The entire mission functioning as an elaborate trap designed to capture not just Maya herself, but to force Valentina into making choices that would serve his larger strategic objectives. I have been aware of your existence since the morning my nephew knelt in that pathetic diner, Cassius said, with the casual cruelty of someone who enjoyed revealing the extent to which his enemies had been manipulated by circumstances they believed they controlled. His aristocratic features arranged in an expression of amused contempt for the human who had dared to involve herself in supernatural politics that were far beyond her understanding or ability to influence. You have been useful, he continued. Your bond with Valentina providing me with a method of drawing the former empress out of hiding that no amount of direct threats or political pressure could accomplish, since her maternal instincts toward Victor were tempered by centuries of political calculation, while her protective feelings toward you represent a weakness I can exploit with precision and timing. Maya understood that she had become the bait in a trap that would force Valentina to choose between abandoning her carefully maintained exile to save a human she had grown to care about, or allowing Maya to die in order to preserve her own safety, and the secrets that her continued freedom represented for the resistance movement that was forming around Elena's network of loyal allies and information sources. The choice Cassius was offering was designed to be impossible: sacrifice Maya and lose the moral authority that made Valentina's leadership meaningful to people who had followed her into exile, or reveal herself and provide Cassius with the opportunity to eliminate both the former empress and her human companion in a single coordinated action that would destroy the last effective opposition to his consolidation of power. Valentina's response exceeded every expectation Maya had developed about vampire politics and royal protocol when the former empress appeared at Cassius's stronghold, not as a fugitive attempting a desperate rescue, but in full ceremonial regalia that transformed her from elderly exile into the embodiment of supernatural monarchy. Her presence, accompanied by Elena and a carefully selected group of followers whose loyalty had been tested through months of shared danger and mutual commitment to principles that transcended personal survival. The ancient laws that governed vampire succession provided Valentina with options that Cassius had apparently failed to consider in his planning, rules that predated his conspiracy and offered precedents for challenging usurpers who had gained power through treachery rather than legitimate inheritance or consensual transition of authority. Valentina formally invoked her right as previous monarch to challenge Cassius's claim to the throne through trial by combat, an archaic but legally binding procedure that would settle the succession dispute through single combat between chosen champions whose victory would be interpreted as divine or supernatural judgment about the rightful ruler. The twist that Maya had not anticipated was Valentina's inability to serve as her own champion due to her voluntary abdication, vampire law requiring that someone who had willingly surrendered power must demonstrate their commitment to reclaiming it by selecting a champion whose life they valued more than their own crown, the choice of representative becoming a public declaration about the principles and priorities that would guide their renewed leadership. Valentina chose Maya with the ceremonial gravity of someone making a decision that would reshape supernatural civilization. Her selection of a human champion representing both unprecedented violation of traditional vampire hierarchy and brilliant strategic positioning that would force the supernatural community to confront fundamental questions about the relationship between power and species, between inherited authority and earned legitimacy. Maya realized in that moment that this had always been Valentina's plan, not to reclaim power for herself, but to ensure that it passed to someone who understood the value of human life and the cost of absolute power, someone whose perspective had been shaped by working for tips and worrying about medical bills rather than by centuries of supernatural privilege and political maneuvering that could disconnect rulers from the consequences of their decisions. If Maya won the trial by combat, she would not just save Victor from Cassius's poison and preserve the policies that had maintained peace between human and supernatural civilizations, but would become the power behind a new kind of vampire rule that integrated human values and priorities into the governance of creatures whose abilities and longevity had traditionally made them indifferent to mortal concerns and perspectives. The ancient combat circle beneath the vampire council chambers had not been used for succession disputes in over 2 centuries, its stone floor worn smooth by the blood of previous champions, whose victories and defeats had shaped the political landscape of supernatural civilization through ritualized violence that served as both legal proceeding and religious ceremony. Representatives from every major faction gathered to witness the trial by combat, their presence transforming what might have been a simple duel into a political event whose outcome would determine not just vampire leadership, but the future relationship between all supernatural communities and the human world they had hidden within for millennia. Maya faced Dmitri, Cassius's chosen champion, armed with silver-plated weapons that Elena had selected for their effectiveness against vampire physiology and her own determination to protect the people she had learned to love through months of transformation from ordinary waitress into someone capable of violence when the stakes justified crossing lines she had never imagined approaching in her previous life. Dmitri represented everything that Cassius's vision of vampire supremacy embodied. Centuries of experience in combat that had refined his skills to supernatural perfection, physical capabilities that exceeded human limitations by orders of magnitude, and the psychological arrogance of someone who had never faced an opponent whose mortality made them desperate enough to employ tactics that honorable combat traditionally prohibited. The fight began with the brutal one-sidedness that everyone expected, Dimitri's attacks flowing with the practiced grace of someone who had killed hundreds of opponents over the course of his extended existence, his movements too fast for normal human perception, and his strength sufficient to shatter bones with casual gestures that Maya barely managed to avoid through reflexes enhanced by her bond with Valentina and training that Elena had compressed into the most intensive education in survival that 3 months could provide. But Maya possessed something that Dmitri lacked, despite his overwhelming advantages in experience and supernatural ability: the capacity to think like prey that had learned to fight back, to employ strategies that predators would dismiss as beneath their dignity, until the moment when desperation and intelligence combined to create opportunities that arrogance and assumptions about inevitable victory had failed to anticipate or defend against. Elena's training had emphasized fighting dirty rather than fighting fair, using the environment as a weapon rather than relying solely on strength and speed, targeting weaknesses that even supernatural beings possessed despite their enhanced durability and accelerated healing abilities. Maya gradually turned the tide of combat through tactics that confused and frustrated Dmitri, her willingness to sacrifice honor for effectiveness, creating openings that a more traditional opponent would never have provided. The decisive moment came when Maya realized that Dmitri, like all ancient vampires who had survived through centuries of assumed superiority, fought with the psychological expectation that his opponents would eventually succumb to the inevitable. His combat style optimized for overwhelming enemies who would recognize their disadvantage and either flee or submit, rather than continuing to resist beyond the point where victory seemed possible. Maya feigned the defeat that Dmitri expected, allowing him to close for what he believed would be the killing blow that would end the trial by combat and confirm Cassius's right to rule vampire civilization according to principles that prioritized supernatural supremacy over the careful balance that Valentina's policies had maintained. But as Dmitri moved in for the final strike, Maya drove her silver stake through his heart with the precision that Elena had drilled into her through countless hours of practice. the vampire champion's arrogance becoming the weakness that allowed a human waitress to achieve victory against odds that should have made her defeat inevitable. Maya's victory was technically legitimate according to the ancient laws that governed trial by combat, but Cassius refused to accept the result with the fury of someone whose carefully orchestrated plans had been destroyed by variables he had failed to consider in his calculations about human limitations and vampire superiority. He called his supporters to arms with declarations that no human should ever possess authority over vampire affairs. His rejection of the trial's outcome, transforming what should have been a formal resolution of succession disputes into the opening battle of a civil war that would determine whether supernatural civilization would continue to operate according to ancient laws and traditions, or would be reshaped by force according to the vision of extremists who believed that centuries of careful coexistence had made them weak and vulnerable to human interference and betrayal. The vampire civil war that had been brewing for months through conspiracy and poison ended with startling swiftness, lasting exactly 3 hours from Cassius's first call to arms until the moment Elena's silver blade found his heart in the ruins of what had once been the council chamber's ceremonial hall. Victor arrived at the height of the battle, his mind cleared by Dr. Xiao Chen's antidote, and his supernatural strength restored to levels that reminded everyone why Valentina had chosen him as her successor decades earlier. His loyal forces turning the tide of combat just as Maya began to wonder whether her victory in trial by combat would matter if Cassius simply murdered everyone who opposed his seizure of power through traditional means of political violence. Seeing his mother return to active leadership and Maya willing to die for supernatural justice that transcended species boundaries, Victor made a decision that surprised everyone present, including Valentina herself, who had spent months planning for various scenarios, but had never anticipated her son's response to the revelation that humans could serve as effective champions in vampire political disputes. Victor formally abdicated his throne with the same ceremonial gravity that had marked royal transitions for centuries. But instead of naming another vampire as his successor, he designated Maya as regent until a new form of government could be established that would represent both human and supernatural interests through a council structure that had never been attempted in the long history of their hidden civilization. The proposal was revolutionary in ways that made even Valentina's progressive policies seem conservative by comparison, suggesting not vampire rule over humans or human dominance over supernatural beings, but genuine cooperation between species whose fundamental differences in biology, psychology, and lifespan had previously made such partnerships impossible to imagine or implement. It was dangerous enough that several vampire lords who had supported Victor against Cassius immediately began reconsidering their loyalties, while werewolf pack leaders demanded guarantees that their territorial agreements would be honored under whatever new system Maya developed with Valentina's guidance and Elena's practical experience in managing the day-to-day realities of supernatural politics. But it was also exactly what Valentina had hoped her strange exile would accomplish: the creation of conditions that would allow someone with human perspective and values to influence supernatural governance in ways that centuries of vampire supremacy had made impossible to achieve through internal reform or gradual evolution of existing power structures. Cassius died in the fighting with Elena's blade between his ribs, his death serving as both practical elimination of the conspiracy's leadership and symbolic revenge for centuries of manipulation and betrayal that had culminated in his attempt to destroy everything Valentina had built through patient diplomacy and careful balance between competing factions whose conflicts could easily escalate into the kind of warfare that would expose the hidden world to human authorities and military intervention. His supporters fled or surrendered with the pragmatic recognition that their cause had died with their leader, accepting amnesty in exchange for supporting the new order, rather than continuing resistance that would only result in their own destruction and the dissolution of whatever influence they might retain in Maya's emerging system of governance. Elena's intelligence network proved invaluable in tracking down the remaining conspirators and convincing them that cooperation offered better prospects for survival and prosperity than exile or continued opposition to changes that had already gained momentum beyond any single faction's ability to reverse or control. Maya returned to Rosie's diner within a week of the Civil War's conclusion, the familiar space restored and reopened under supernatural protection that made it simultaneously more secure than any government building and more welcoming than it had ever been during her previous employment as an ordinary waitress serving ordinary customers who never suspected the true nature of the elderly woman in booth 7. She still worked the morning shift, but now her customers included vampires who no longer needed to hide their true nature, werewolves who could discuss pack business openly, and humans who had been brought into the hidden world through various circumstances and were learning to navigate the complex social dynamics of supernatural civilization. Danny, fully healed by vampire medicine that had accomplished in days what human treatments might never have achieved, helped run the diner with the enthusiasm of an 8-year-old who found nothing strange about serving coffee to customers whose biology required them to avoid sunlight or whose dietary needs included raw meat that would horrify normal restaurant patrons. He attended school like any other child his age, but his tutors included a centuries-old vampire who taught him ancient history from personal experience, and a werewolf professor who explained ecological relationships from the perspective of someone who had lived as both predator and environmental steward for longer than human civilization had existed in its current form. The integration of human and supernatural societies proceeded with the slow, careful pace that Maya had learned to expect from any project involving multiple species with different biological needs, psychological structures, and cultural traditions that had developed over millennia of separation and mutual suspicion. 6 months after Victor's abdication, Maya sat in booth 7 every morning at 6:17, sharing coffee with Valentina as they planned the next phases of a transformation that was simultaneously more complex and more promising than either of them had dared to hope when their relationship began with simple acts of kindness exchanged between customer and waitress. The process was filled with setbacks that ranged from minor cultural misunderstandings to serious security breaches that threatened to expose the integration project to human extremist groups who would view supernatural beings as threats requiring military response. But for the first time in centuries, both worlds were working toward cooperation rather than domination or hiding. Victor had found peace as a private citizen, his supernatural abilities redirected toward helping Dr. Chen expand her medical practice to serve both communities with treatments that combined the best of human scientific research and supernatural healing methods that had been refined through centuries of trial and error. Elena continued to run intelligence operations designed to prevent extremist groups from either side from sabotaging the integration process through violence or exposure that would force governments to choose between acknowledging supernatural citizens or treating them as foreign agents, requiring deportation or imprisonment. Marcus's bookstore had evolved into an unofficial embassy where humans and supernatural beings could meet on neutral ground, his extensive collection of texts serving as reference material for the legal scholars and diplomats who were writing the treaties and constitutional frameworks that would govern Maya's emerging council system. But Maya's transformation from ordinary human to supernatural regent came with permanent costs that she was only beginning to understand as the months passed, and she noticed changes in her aging process that marked her as something other than fully mortal, despite retaining most of her human psychology and emotional responses. She aged slowly now, the bond with Valentina and her exposure to vampire magic altering her cellular structure in ways that would extend her lifespan far beyond normal human limits while simultaneously isolating her from the natural rhythms of birth, growth, and death that connected her to the species she was working to protect and represent. She would outlive Danny, outlive most of the humans she cared about, witness the deaths of friends and colleagues while remaining essentially unchanged by the passage of time that would transform everything around her, according to patterns she could observe but no longer fully participate in, as someone whose mortality had once made every moment precious and every relationship temporary. She had gained power and purpose that allowed her to influence the future of two civilizations, but she had lost the simple life she had once wanted. The dream of nursing school and ordinary concerns about rent payments and medical bills replaced by responsibilities that would define not just her own existence, but the trajectory of human and supernatural coexistence for generations to come. The letter from the Fae courts arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt exactly like the morning when Victor had first walked into the diner and changed her understanding of reality. The formal request for her mediation in a dispute with human environmental groups, representing the kind of challenge that she was learning to expect, as her reputation as a bridge between worlds grew beyond the vampire community to encompass other supernatural factions whose conflicts with human society required someone who understood both perspectives and possessed the political authority to negotiate binding agreements. The waitress who had just wanted to help her brother pay for cancer treatments had become a diplomatic figure whose decisions affected international relations between species whose existence most humans still considered mythology. Her signature on treaties and arbitration decisions, carrying the weight of law for millions of beings whose lives depended on maintaining the careful balance she was learning to manage through combination of intuition, experience, and advice from allies whose loyalty had been tested through shared danger and mutual commitment to principles that transcended personal survival or factional advantage. As Maya prepared for this new challenge, she found herself looking out the diner window at the early morning sun that Valentina could never see without pain, understanding with the clarity that came from months of difficult choices and permanent consequences that every decision, every sacrifice, every moment of courage or fear had led to this moment where she sat between worlds as someone who was no longer fully human but was exactly where she needed to be to protect both the people she had been born among and the creatures she had learned to serve. The final image that would remain with her through whatever challenges lay ahead was simple and profound. Maya refilling Valentina's coffee cup with the same care she had shown when she was an ordinary waitress, serving an ordinary customer. The two women planning their next move in a war for the future of two worlds while outside the diner window. Human and supernatural citizens began another day in a world that was slowly learning that monsters and heroes might be the same people after all, that the boundaries between species were less important than the choices individuals made about how to treat those who were different from themselves, and that sometimes the most significant changes in history began with small acts of kindness exchanged between strangers who discovered they had more in common than anyone had dared to believe.